100,000 deaths. Who or what is to blame? Social media, as I was saying to Mike, shouldn't be the go-to location for accuracy, the playground of hyperbole, the den of iniquity that is the biggest echo chamber on earth. But it does sometimes kind of act as a sort of vague litmus test on where certain aspects of public opinion are. 100,000 people dead. Now, if you follow the line from some of those voices that you see on social media, it's all because of Boris Johnson. How dare he look sad? Seems to be a big headline. How dare he look sad? It's his fault. Boris has blood on his hands. Boris has killed these people. Every one of these deaths is down to Boris Johnson. The hyperventilating hysteria, it seems, knows no bounds. These are the kind of death porn addicts, as we describe them this week. They pretend to show sadness for these kind of numbers. They're not really that sad. I mean, these grim statistics are kind of weaponised by the extreme left and then used as a morbid stick to beat the wicked Tories. And that really is the point here. I've got a problem with this, and the evidence is also, if you look around, the evidence is very similar in other countries as well. So we're looking at this figure of, 100,000 people. And I'm not going to go down that path, and we've never gone down that path on this programme of diluting that or pretending that it doesn't really reflect the severity of something. It's massively severe. There's a pandemic going on, for goodness sake, and therefore there will be excess deaths. That goes with the territory. We're not alone. France, pretty much 75,000 people dying. Is 75,000 some kind of moral victory over 100,000? Spain, nearly 60,000. Italy, 87,000. And counting. Germany, 55,000. The USA, if you get into that territory, 435,000. They have people dying in states in tens of thousands. You look at Belgium, far higher death rate than the UK. Slovakia, Portugal also sit at the top of that horrible league table as well. And it's interesting, when I look at Germany as an obvious example, which was in the early days, remember, was seen as some sort of beacon of hope. Merkel had it all sorted out. Germany know what they're doing. We've got no idea. We should be doing what the Germans are doing, etc. Well, frankly, when the death rate in this country was 55,000, the very same people were still blaming Boris Johnson and saying that he had blood on his hands and he was the killer, almost the killer of all of these people. Who or what is to blame for the 100,000? 0344 499 1000. Why didn't Boris Johnson close the borders? That's a big one, of course. Yeah, he could have done. He could have done, but no one was asking for this at the time. None of the EU countries closed their borders, if you ever remember the borders in France being closed? Of course not. Germany closed some landlocked borders. They didn't close their borders. That simply didn't happen. In this country, Sturgeon didn't ask for the borders to be closed. She could have had the borders closed, but didn't. Planes were flying into Scotland on a daily basis throughout this. Similarly in Wales too. Even the head of the World Health Organization, that's Tedros Ghebreyesus, back in February said there was no need for measures that, quote, unnecessarily interfere with international trade or travel, end quote. The UK was not alone. Most of the world didn't close their borders. Perhaps they should have done. But if this is one of the arguments being used to blame Boris Johnson, then you'd have to equally apportion blame to all of those other countries as well. And even if we had closed the borders, say in March or April, what kind of figure are we looking at today anyway? 80,000? 90,000? What would it be? What would be the significant difference? Would that somehow be acceptable? And if he had closed the borders, I certainly believe those same voices would have found another reason to beat Johnson over the head. And by the way, he makes no bones that the buck stops with him. Excess deaths is often used as a more accurate way to measure where we're at. And this is true, by the way. If it's about gauging what you could argue are deaths specifically related to the pandemic, then yes, excess deaths are clearly going to be there. But I would say this. Did anyone seriously think there wouldn't be excess deaths during a global killing pandemic? Of course, would it not be strange if the very same pandemic didn't produce excess deaths? In fact, you might argue that if there were no excess deaths, there was no real pandemic in the conventional sense, given the way that pandemics work, which is usually to cause excess deaths by something new coming onto the system. 0344 499 1000. I was talking to a scientist recently who said that even if we closed all the borders, even if we'd not released anyone into care homes, we'd still be sitting here today with 70,000, 80,000, maybe more deaths. So you were never going to stop this. What could Boris Johnson have done? I would echo Priti Patel, oddly. It's a rare moment, and let me be crystal clear in echoing Priti Patel. She apparently did say maybe the border should have been closed in March. We'll never know the full truth of that, but that was the word on the street a week or so ago, and I think that would have been a good thing to do. The care home situation, you remember Matt Hancock essentially just told an absolute whopper when he said we put a ring of steel around the care homes. No, you didn't. You absolutely didn't. And people were released from hospital into care homes. And I think, and I have no evidence for this, but just reading between the lines and looking at all the discussions we've done on this, all the epidemiologists and microbiologists, and virologists and people we've spoken to on this issue, it seems that the big area of fear were the hospitals themselves. And Mike Graham was just telling a story of a friend of his, somebody he used to work alongside, who went in, very old, 88 years of age, went in for a hip replacement, incredibly vulnerable, got COVID while in hospital and died, and therefore COVID is on the death certificate. Now, I don't know how many people, that would be an excess death, of course, because he may well have died half a year later of something else. The COVID on the death certificate means that he tested positive in the last 28 days. Doesn't mean to say he died of COVID. Dying with and of, as I continue to say, are two very different things. This doesn't reduce anything, by the way. It doesn't alter the severity. But we're grown-ups here. We should be able to have these conversations. I'm not trying to find a way to say this is less serious than it is. I'm intrigued as to where we point the finger, if we do need to point the finger. Who or what is responsible for the 100,000 deaths? 0344 499 1000. It's been devastating to me to look at the kind of comment that comes, and I'm not just talking about, the odd dimwit on social media. I'm talking about respected journalists who have newspaper columns and national radio programs, who will quite casually just write how Boris Johnson is responsible. And the question I did ask somebody this. Rare to dip my toe into argument territory on social media. I try not to go there very often. Once in a while, I'll put a little riposte onto something or try and clarify something, but these things generally end in tears and take up 3 hours of your life continuing to argue back. And most people who are entrenched in this view that wicked Boris and the terrible uncaring Tories are responsible for this will never move that position, no matter what evidence you put in front of them. But I did say to someone who talked about this terrible, the UK should be ashamed. And again, I replied really with the same point. And I deliberately said, I can see that Sturgeon and Drakeford and Johnson did not act well here, blah, blah, blah. And there was a pile-in on that. Why are you blaming Sturgeon? And, well, I'm sorry. The last time I looked, I'm not blaming Sturgeon. I'm simply suggesting that at the time, neither Mark Drakeford in Wales, Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, Keir Starmer sitting on the other side of the aisle in the House of Commons, no one in March was saying, close the borders. Nobody was screaming, close the borders. As we moved towards that conversation becoming more and more commonplace, the likes of Mr. Starmer started to pitch in, and Captain Hindsight started to call on things to happen that he knew were kind of going to happen anyway. 0344 499 1000. I just want to chunk this one down if we can. 100,000 deaths. It's a terrible figure. And in a pandemic, you will have excess deaths. I don't think there's such... Is there a pandemic out there that didn't have excess deaths? I would assume that would be quite rare. I've had lots of emails from people as well telling the same story as Mike Graham, that people who've died of cancer but also had COVID will go down as one of those statistics. Now, if we want to do this properly, and I'm aware that the minute you have this conversation, somebody starts shouting that you're kind of denying the seriousness. Or even worse, those dimwits who say you're denying COVID, for goodness sake. Blimey. It's curious, but that suits those people to think that, because they can then make sense of their own nonsensical position. You have to ask those questions. So I'm just going to put it out there, fairly route one. Who or what is responsible? Incredible. Who is responsible? Let's speak with Lord Norman Warner, former Health Minister under Tony Blair. Lord Warner, afternoon to you. I know it's a fairly crass way of just getting into this, but just to answer that question in its most basic form, who or what is to blame? Good afternoon.
Well, I certainly don't think, good afternoon, and I certainly don't think it's inevitable that 100,000 people should have died of this condition in this space of time. I'm not a great one for allocating blame, but I do think if we don't learn from what has gone wrong on this in handling this pandemic, we won't prepare ourselves for the next pandemic. And the only thing which is likely is that sometime in the next few years, there will be another pandemic. And so we do actually need to ask some tough questions, I think, about what has gone wrong. I'm not of the view that we can simply blame the Prime Minister. But at the end of the day, there are certain things which we can identify as suspect. First of all, I think they were rather slow to engage with the fact that there was a rather dangerous virus. It had been seen in other parts of the world and it was likely to come here. Secondly, it doesn't look to me as though, and Jeremy Hunt has said something similar, it doesn't look to me as though the government was, and the previous government were prepared for a pandemic. And thirdly, you have to ask some questions about some of the things that were done, particularly in relation to care homes. I mean, it is not inevitable that on the 15th of March 2020, you discharge a very large number of people from NHS hospitals with coronavirus to care homes. And those care homes don't have the PPE, do not have the training, do not have the protection of their staff to cope with that. That's a decision that was taken by someone in government to do that. I'll stop there, but there are some other things.
No, I would agree with that and put care homes up there. I think, Norman, the bit that kind of intrigues me, and this is, I suppose, is just about the heady world of crass polarity that we've sort of arrived in when it comes to debate and the like at the moment. You know, this binary thinking, it's got to be their fault, they're to blame, we're the good side, they're the bad side. And I look at the points you've just raised, and I would echo those as well. But if you look at other countries, then the care home issue you see repeated in other places too. Even on our own turf in Scotland, we know there were terrible figures for care home deaths of people who've been released from hospital. We also know that in France and in Italy, Spain, the same story there as well. So is this a case where it's very politically convenient for some people to point the finger at Boris Johnson and say the wicked Tories are responsible? Who doesn't love that narrative? You know, the wicked Tories. It feeds right into every sort of old-fashioned left-wing stereotype, if you like. However, this story seems to replicate right across the globe. The same, whether it's care homes, whether it's that issue of borders not closing, whatever it happens to be, we see the same story in other places.
Well, that's true up to a point. But the care homes issue has been knocking around way before the pandemic. The situation in care homes have been underfunded for something like 10 to 15 years. I was on a committee which tried to put some of that right, the Dilnot Commission, back in 2010. But I don't want to go on about that. What I would like to go on to is to say something about what has happened since November, which you drew on in your introduction. Something badly has gone wrong in terms of the communication with the public, because we see this very huge, sudden surge in deaths since October.
Yeah.
And that's difficult to explain. And you have to ask some questions about whether the government had got their messaging right. And certainly, I don't think the government's messaging was effective. And we can have a long debate about where that went wrong. But the idea that everyone was obeying the government's instructions about social distancing, about wearing masks, about washing hands, frankly, is for the birds. Because if they had all been doing that, then we wouldn't have had that surge, in my view. And I think the scientists would agree.
So it's individuals, Lord Warner, not just governments.
I think that the citizenry also have quite a lot to answer for.
I'd echo that. And in fact, just to compound the sort of grimness or the starkness of these statistics, a quarter of all official COVID deaths have happened since the 3rd of January. So it's all that recent.
Well, the television doesn't always tell the truth, but it doesn't always lie either. And the pictures of crowds of people gathering together, despite the advice, despite the evidence it's a bad thing to do, cannot all be laid at the door of Boris Johnson. We could argue, I would argue, that the message about saving the NHS was not necessarily the smartest message to give to the citizenry. I mean, it's all very well saying protect the NHS, and I don't want to damage the NHS. But I think many people in most countries think their healthcare system is good enough to cope with emergencies. And I think somewhere in going for the argument that we've got to do this to save the NHS, we lost the point that we've got to do this to save our fellow citizens, which is in many ways a more powerful message. And I'm not sure we got across the message that this was all about us doing the responsible thing as citizens to save our fellow citizens. Yeah. And that has got lost somewhere along the way.
I think you're right on that point, Lord Norman Warner. Thank you. Former health minister. He was health minister under Tony Blair, not fully pointing the finger at Boris Johnson there. But of course, he's the prime minister. He clearly would have to take, and doesn't refute this, by the way, a lot of the stick on this. But fascinating about the stat, if you consider, there it is, half of all deaths in this country have happened since the 11th of November. Since the 11th of November. Is anybody going to tell me since the 11th of November you didn't know the rules about masks, about distancing, about not getting together in big crowds? Since the 11th of November, a quarter of all official COVID deaths since the pandemic started have happened since the 3rd of January. What do you want me to go further? 1 in 10 in the last 8 days. I mean, this is how bad it is. Nobody is going to say that in the last 8 days you didn't know what the rules were on this one. And I think he's right that the Save the NHS thing might have kind of slightly enveloped or masked some of the other messaging, which was equally as crucial.